So, where do we draw the line between someone's deeply held personal beliefs and their professional duties? It's a tricky question, right? Well, today we're going to dive into a really fascinating UK High Court ruling that tackles this head on. It involves a teacher, her classroom, and a major clash between rights and responsibilities. All right, so our guide for this whole thing is the official judgment right from the Royal Courts of Justice. This document is the bedrock, laying out every single argument and, of course, the final verdict. And believe me, this decision has set a huge precedent for professionals all across the UK. And this really gets to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? The court had to answer this fundamental question: where is that line? You've got this conflict between basic human rights, like freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and the specific duties that come with a job, especially a job where you're in a position of influence, like a teacher. So here's how we're going to break this all down to really understand how the court got to its final decision. We'll start with the teacher's beliefs, then look at what actually happened in the classroom. From there, we'll see what the first disciplinary panel found, how she challenged it in the High Court, what that final verdict was, and then, what it all means for this tricky balance between our rights and our responsibilities. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning with the personal convictions that really kicked this whole thing off. The person at the center of this story is Gladys Legger, who is a teacher of modern foreign languages and religious studies. According to the official court judgment, Miss Leger's beliefs are absolutely central to her faith. She felt that some of the school's teaching materials, particularly on things like LGBTQ+ topics, were in direct conflict with her Christian convictions, and this was causing her a great deal of distress. And that brings us to the incident itself, the moment this all boiled over. It all happened during a religious studies lesson with a class of 11 and 12-year-olds. The lesson plan for that day was about human rights, and it included a presentation on LGBTQ+ topics. Now, one of the students, who had apparently been advised by her mother, took detailed notes of what the teacher was saying. When a disciplinary panel later reviewed these allegations, they were very specific. They found it was proven she'd said things like being LGBTQ+ is not fine, and that it's a sin, and also that transgender people are just confused, among other statements. The fallout from that student's complaint was swift and serious. The school launched an investigation, and Ms. Leger was suspended just a month later. By May, only 2 months after that, she was dismissed from her job. But that was far from the end of the story. So after she was dismissed, the case got escalated to the Teaching Regulation Agency. They put together what's called a professional conduct panel. This is the official group that's in charge of making sure teachers are meeting professional standards. And the panel's conclusion? Pretty blunt: unacceptable professional conduct. But what's really important here is their reasoning. It wasn't about her personal beliefs. It was about her actions. They decided that by presenting her views as facts and refusing to teach the planned lesson, she had undermined the school's entire mission to be a supportive, inclusive place for all its students. While Miss Leger was not about to accept that decision, she believed her fundamental rights had been trampled on, so she took her case to one of the highest courts in the UK, asking for a judicial review of what the panel had decided. Her legal team brought forward a few key arguments. First, they said the panel totally ignored the context, that this was a religious studies class where she was just answering student questions. They also argued the process was unfair because the charge of failing to provide a balanced view wasn't something she was formally accused of from the start. And the big one, they argue the whole thing was a breach of her human rights to freedom of religion and expression. And that brings us to the main event, the High Court's verdict. The judge now had the massive task of weighing all of these powerful arguments and complex legal ideas to make a final call. Okay, so to really get the judge's thinking, you have to understand this one key legal concept: qualified rights. It sounds fancy, but all it really means is that some rights, like freedom of speech or religion, aren't an absolute free-for-all. The law says they can be limited, but only if it's to protect the rights and freedoms of other people, in this case, the well-being of the students. The court had to decide if limiting Miss Leger's rights was justified. So to make that call, the judge used a legal framework called the proportionality test. You can think of it like a 4-step checklist. 1. Is the goal, protecting students, important enough to even consider limiting someone's rights? 2. Does the action, finding her guilty of misconduct, actually help achieve that goal? 3. Could they have done something less severe? And 4, the big one, did they strike a fair balance between the teacher's rights and the interests of the whole school community? After putting all the evidence and arguments through this rigorous test, the High Court came to a very clear decision. The judge dismissed Miss Leger's challenge on every single one of her legal grounds.
The original finding of unacceptable professional conduct stood.
This quote from the judgment really gets to the very core of the court's reasoning. The judge basically confirmed that a teacher's professional duties to keep pupils safe and to support the school's inclusive values had to come first here. The court found that her actions, no matter what her intentions were, put students at risk and undermined the school's entire purpose. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway from this really complex and sensitive case? Well, it all boils down to that fundamental tension between our individual rights and our professional responsibilities. You can really see the court's decision as a balancing act. On one side of the scale, you have the teacher's very important rights to freedom of religion and expression. But on the other side, you have her professional duties to protect her students, to respect others, and to follow school policies. In the end, the court decided that, in the context of a classroom full of young students, those duties just had to carry more weight. And this is probably the single most important point to take away from all of this. The High Court went out of its way to say it was not passing judgment on her Roman Catholic faith. This case was never about what she believed, it was about how she chose to express those beliefs in a classroom to young, impressionable students from her position of authority as their teacher. So, this ruling really leaves us with a huge question that goes way beyond this one school, doesn't it? It forces all of us to think about where these lines should be drawn. In our diverse society, how do we protect an individual's personal convictions while also making sure that people in public-facing jobs are doing them in a way that's safe, inclusive, and respectful for everybody? That's the complex balance this case makes us all think about.